Assalamu alaikum. I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now my guest today is the Right Honourable Stephen Timms, formerly the MP for East Ham, who entered Parliament in 1994 and at the 2010 elections was described as having the safest seat in Britain with over 70% of the constituency vote and a 27,826 majority, the largest at the time in the House of Commons. Remarkably, and against the national swing against Labour in 2015, he retained that seat with an increased 77% of the vote. Stephen Timms has always been known as an MP strongly in favour of the role and contribution of faith in British society. He's chair of the all-party Parliamentary Group for Faith and Society, and he was appointed by Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour Party's faith envoy. He's a member of Christians of the Left and has regularly spoken about how his own Christian faith has motivated his politics. Stephen Timms' constituency of East Ham forms a part of the borough of Newham in which 3/4 of the population are non-white. Over a third are Muslim and more than half are Asian, the fourth highest proportion of any constituency in England and Wales. It's also home to a large black population and is probably one of the most diverse communities in the country. Assalamu alaikum, Stephen, and welcome to In Focus.
Thank you, Carl. Very pleased to be here.
Now, before we get too embroiled in the issue surrounding the forthcoming elections, I wonder if you would be kind enough to explain why you think that faith is such a significant part of your politics.
Well, people do very often say, of course, you shouldn't mix faith and politics, and if you do, they say, you're asking for trouble, and they point to trouble somewhere in the world, Belfast or somewhere, and you can understand why they make that case. But I think that's actually a mistaken case to make. I think the truth is that faith is a very good starting point for politics, and probably the best starting point there is, because religious faith is the source of exactly the values that we need to make politics work. Responsibility, solidarity, patience, persistence, compassion, truthfulness. All of these are qualities which I think have been a bit eroded in our society, and if we're looking for sources to renew them, it's the faith communities that are the best place to look, and certainly those are the values that we need to make our politics work. So what I want to see is more people whose starting point is a committed religious faith to bring those values with them into politics and to take part with everyone else in the work of deciding what the future of our society should be. That's what we need.
Well, I think that we must hope that more and more people listen to your concept of the values of faith, because we seem to be shifting to exactly the opposite in terms of the way that faith is regarded. Is that not fair to say?
Well, actually, I think if you look around our society, there are all kinds of things that are being done now, which actually probably weren't being done 15 or 20 years ago, which are enormously valuable and which are very clearly coming from a starting point of faith. I mean, probably the most spectacular has been the food bank movement over the last 10 years or so. The Trussell Trust food banks provided food for over 1 million households in the last year. Every single one of those is based on a church. In a number of areas, Islamic Relief has organised in the mosques to support the collection of food. And that has been an extraordinary impact for the good. It's just as well it's happened, because if it hadn't happened, an awful lot of people would have really been destitute. It's a shame that it's been needed, but it has been needed.
No, you've been.
And it's been the values of faith that have contributed that to our
you've been
society.
outspoken about the role of faith in helping the form of the food banks, as you just mentioned. And we've seen figures from the Trussell Trust which have talked about the escalating, tragic escalating figures in numbers of people who. I'm going to quote you. You said the welfare state should be there when people need it, and work should pay enough so that people who are working don't have to rely on charity to feed their family. We're determined to reduce the number of people having to go to food banks, you said. Figures revealed at the end of last year showed food bank usage which had already reached unprecedented levels, on the rise to with over 1 million emergency food packages being distributed by the various trusts in the last year. The All Parties Parliamentary Group on hunger estimated to be that was only half of the real numbers on the ground. The APPG found that insecure work arrangements and high living costs were the key drivers of food poverty, with the poorest households requiring 41% of their income to cover costs of food and fuel.
See, this is a very interesting point, that when I was a minister in the Labour governments, we used to say that work is the best route out of poverty, and that kind of made sense. And I noticed Theresa May this week has said the same thing, work is the best route out of poverty. But what is very clear when you talk to people, as I've been doing over the last couple of weeks on the high street in East Ham here, most people are in work, but that doesn't mean they're out of poverty. If their hours are insecure, if they're on 0 hours contracts, they don't know from 1 week to the next how many hours work they're going to get. A lot of people on very low part-time hours. That doesn't get you out of poverty. And it's this insecurity that you mentioned, which is a really very dramatic feature of how the labour market works at the moment.
So do you believe then that Labour's plans announced this week to reverse benefit caps, to unfreeze the working age benefits and inject £10 billion into the benefit system over the next 5 years, will that be enough to produce a reduction in food bank usage?
Well, it'll certainly help, and the manifesto as a whole, I think, will go a very long way indeed. But I mean, actually, there isn't a commitment in there to reverse the benefit cap. I wasn't sure whether you mentioned that, but there is a commitment to reverse the cuts in employment and support allowance, just taken effect, £30 a week being taken out of the benefit of people who are too sick to work. I mean, I think that's a dreadful change, and I'm very pleased that our manifesto is committing a Labour government to putting that money back to people who desperately need it.
Now, we're talking about the figures in the manifesto this week. Predictions even from Len McCluskey, the leader of the Unite Union, one of the biggest donors to the Labour Party, that he said it cannot possibly win the election against what he says is a tide of hostile media against its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. He said that if it manages to retain 200 seats, its worst performance that would be since the war, it will have done well in the campaign. The Labour Party's undergone radical change. I don't think many people can deny that under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And I'm aware that back in 2015, you declined an offer of a post in his cabinet, stepping down at the time from, I think, you were in Work and Pensions at that time. Do you agree with McCluskey's prediction, and will a return of 200 seats or less be a disaster for Labour and the country? Do you blame this on a hostile media or possibly the failures of leadership?
Well, first of all, I mean, Len McCluskey, I think, has changed his mind. According to reports today, he now says, having read the manifesto, that he thinks Labour can win with it. I must say, when I was talking yesterday evening to people on the doorsteps around here, a lot of people were very positive about what they'd heard about our manifesto. And I mean, it's certainly the most positive thing that's happened, I think, so far in this campaign for us. A lot of good ideas in there, and ideas that have impressed a lot of people. So I certainly think it would be disastrous if Labour was to fall below 200 seats. I hope, and Jeremy Corbyn has underlined, that we are determined to win this election, and anything short of winning will be a failure. And certainly the kind of figure that Len McCluskey was talking about would be utterly disastrous. So no, we're out to win. That's what Jeremy Corbyn is going up and down the country to achieve.
Now, Labour's pledged to introduce higher tax bands for the richest 5%. Anybody earning over 80,000 is likely to see increase in tax. There is a reversal of the 20 billion corporation tax cuts. It's projected that these tax changes are going to deliver an additional revenue of about £48.6 billion. The manifesto also pledges to nationalise the water industry, to bring the railway, Royal Mail and parts of the energy market back into public ownership. Now, there is also a pledge that Labour will reverse the current benefits cap, that it will end the current government's 4-year freeze on working age benefits by injecting £10 billion into the benefit system over 5 years, additional support for universal credit, and reversal of benefit cuts to the disabled, as you mentioned just a moment ago. The bedroom tax, payment for bereaved parents, and also pledged to do away with university tuition fees. All this is going to apparently cost about £50 billion. Now, you were a senior minister at the Treasury in several cabinets during your lengthy career in Parliament. Do you believe that the numbers stack up, and can the books be balanced?
Well, the numbers certainly do add up, and it is a striking and I think quite an impressive feature of this manifesto that there is a separate document which goes through the costings, tells you exactly how much each of the policy commitments in that manifesto will cost and where the money is going to come from. I haven't seen that in any party's manifesto in the past, and I welcome it. I think it's a valuable innovation, and it does help to concentrate the minds in understanding what exactly the party wants the money to go into.
I suppose it does help after the trip up of Diane Abbott last week when she became confused at the announcement of the changes to the police force numbers.
Well, I think clarity always helps. And I was looking through it today, it's published yesterday, and it is quite impressive just to set out line by line how much each of these things is going to cost and where exactly the same amount will come from in tax rises. A bit more, as you say, for people earning over £80,000. And I think, most people can see that Conservative austerity policies have hit the buffers. We cannot go on in the health service with this almost kind of weekly crisis, the latest one with the cyber attack, because everybody can see we're not spending enough on the NHS at the moment. The money has to come from somewhere, and I think the proposal in the manifesto that people, the top 5%, the highest paid 5%, those earning £80,000, having to pay a little bit more in income tax in order to allow the health service to do what all of us know it needs to do. I think that is absolutely right. And I welcome the clarity with which that's been set out and the clear allocation of the funds coming from the tax rises to the things that need to be done.
Now, your constituency of East Ham has unemployment figures of 9.9%, at least according to the latest sort of published figures, which sometimes I have to confess can be as much as a year or so old, but much higher than the national average, which is about 3.5%. A House of Commons Women and Equalities Committee report last year warned that Muslim people in the UK are much more likely to be unemployed than any other faith group in the country. It suggests that not enough was being done to ensure that British Muslims were afforded the same employment opportunities as the rest of society, and that meant that in the Muslim community as much as 12.8% were experiencing unemployment, when the national average was nearer to 5.4% of the general population. Now, how is the issue of addressing unemployment, how important is it, and also the issue of discrimination in the workplace?
Well, I think both of those are absolutely vital issues, and I always have thought that. I became a councillor around here 33 years ago and started talking to people about the various problems that they had, and it became clear to me very quickly that the one thing that really changed a person's life for the better was getting a job. At the time, unemployment was sky high, and we have actually made a lot of progress around here. For me, the best moment over the period that I've been a Member of Parliament was the 2012 Olympics, when suddenly East London was in the world spotlight. A lot of jobs were created, a fair number of them permanent jobs at Westfield Shopping Centre next to the Olympic Park, but of course a large number as well of temporary jobs. And one of the things that the organising committee for the Olympic Games did was to commission East London Citizens, Telco, which is a coalition of faith groups, mosques, churches, trade unions, but community organisations. They commissioned that group to recruit people for the temporary jobs on the Olympics. And it was very striking. I think a lot of Muslims, because the channel being used was the mosque, for many Muslims it was a route into employment. An opportunity was provided which many grasped, and from what I can see, a lot have been able to go on to get other jobs. Having got that onto their CV, the experience at the Olympic Games, they were then able to go and get jobs elsewhere. So I think this is a very important area. And I do think it's a clear example of an area in which working with faith groups can help us to reach people who the more conventional methods, the job centres and so on, are not reaching. And I'm very critical of the way job centres have developed over the last 7 years, because a lot of people, their experience of going to a job centre these days is simply that the officials are trying to catch them out to find an excuse for taking their benefits off them.
But also, part of my question was the discrimination issue. I mean, you've worked in the works and Pensions Department, but although not in 2009, because back in 2009, the Work and Pensions Commission just sort of study, I think the one way to call it. So others have referred to it as a sting operation, as they sent out over 3,000 CVs, applications, with, on the one hand with Asian sounding names, on the other hand English sounding names. Now the disproportionality in response was staggering. I think one member of the cabinet at the time referred to it as scandalous. What it does do is underline that there is obviously a very serious issue with discrimination in the workplace.
There is. There are continuing. I mean, we sometimes think we've got over these things. We haven't got over them. There is still a serious problem of discrimination against Muslims, actually discrimination against women as well. Similar exercises show that too, to quite such a big extent, but it's still a problem there. And I think, you know, there is quite a strong case for what some more enlightened employers are now doing, which is name-blind recruitment, where the person who's making the decision doesn't get to see the name of the individual. They don't know whether they're a Muslim, they don't know whether they're Asian, they don't know whether it's a man or a woman. All they see is the qualifications and experience that that individual
So that's
brings.
not government-led, that's initiatives on the...
It's down to the employers to choose to do that. And I mean, the public sector is taking a bit of a lead on this, but others are doing it as well.
And what can government do? Do you think government can impose a requirement for that sort of blind selection process?
Well, I think the most effective thing that government can do, I think, is probably give a lead. I think trying to kind of pass regulations to require people to do some of these things is probably not going to work.
Well, there is always the carrot and the stick. I mean, they can give incentives.
There are various approaches that can be. I mean, in reality here, as you said, a third of my constituents are Muslims. We are soon going to be the first community in the country where the majority of the population is under 25. This is where the growth of Britain's working age population is coming from. Employers have to be able to tap into the skills and experience and abilities of Muslims and other young people in this area, and I'm sure they will work out how to do it, but they do need to get a bit of a move on.
Now, a recent report by the Council of Mosques in Bradford served to highlight what they saw as the big issues facing the Muslim community in the run-up to the elections in the next few weeks. Hate crime, poor education, unemployment, they say with the diminishing opportunities in traditional industries, which were the traditional support lifeline for immigrants coming to Britain. But they also said the intense scrutiny faced by the community due to the menace, they said, of terrorism. Do you acknowledge that hate crime, Islamophobia is on the rise? Do you think that the level of scrutiny by government and intelligence services, especially with the introduction of these very harsh new terrorism laws, is justifiable? What do you make of the widespread feeling amongst the Muslim community that they are being treated as a suspect community?
Well, I understand that, and I'm very pleased that our manifesto, the Labour Party manifesto, commits a Labour government to reviewing Prevent. And I've got a lot of reservations about the way that Prevent has been working. And the worst thing about it for me is it kind of gives the impression that if you're a religious person, you are suspect in some way. When the reality is, if in fact you are a person who's a member of a church or a mosque or a temple and you're meeting regularly with others in that context, you're far less likely to be doing bad things than if you're excluded from those communities. So I think there is a serious flaw at the heart of the thinking that ministers since 2010 have. I'm sure there are some good things being done under the banner of Prevent, but I do think it's time for a review, and actually the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, David Anderson, has called for a review as well, and I've just recently signed a call for it.
I think he almost called for it to be done away with, and there are many people. I mean, because trust is a fundamental component of any sort of issue that relates to terrorism. I think most people would agree with that, and it's been lost. Do you not think it's time that they drew the line under it and did away with it?
I think there clearly is a problem. There is a problem around extremists, tiny number of them, and I think it's right that government should address that. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't. But I do think there is a problem about the way that Prevent works. But on your why, and I'm impressed by the list that the Bradford Council of Mosques has come up with. Let me just say a couple of things in response to that. One is, if you look at what Muslim young people around here are now achieving in school, in college, in university, there are very, very impressive young people growing up in this part of London, doing very well in their education. And I think those young people have got a great deal to look forward to in our economy, in our labour market, in the future. I don't think they're not going to be looking for those low-skill jobs that, as the Council of Mosques points out, in the past, people coming freshly into the country have tended to get those jobs, and those jobs are disappearing. But the next generation, they're aiming high and they're going to achieve high, and we need to support them and make sure that our schools and our colleges continue to do a very good job in supporting them. One of the things I'm really worried about, the Conservatives are proposing, is to take a lot of money away from schools in London in order to hand it out in the countryside areas. Well, I've got no problems about the countryside schools getting more money, but please don't take it from us, because our schools are now doing a good job for those Muslim young people and others. We need them to carry on. The other point I make is this. I am very worried about where Theresa May is heading on Brexit, because there is a real threat to jobs, exactly the kind of jobs we have in this part of London for young people growing up in the area. And if Theresa May was to be re-elected and mishandled these negotiations, as I fear she might well, I'm afraid a large number of jobs are going to leave the UK. They'll go off to France and Germany or Ireland, and we won't then have the opportunities that we need to make the most of the abilities of these very bright young people coming forward at the moment.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Brexit. I know that you're one of only a handful of MPs who defied the party whip in voting to support Theresa May's launch of the Article 50.
I voted against Theresa May.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's right.
If I didn't make that clear, I'm glad that you have. But do you feel that it was right now, in hindsight, to defy that whip?
Well, as I've just said, I feel very strongly that leaving the EU, if Theresa May was to be Prime Minister and didn't achieve what she says she wants to achieve, and I fear that she won't, would be economically very damaging. So I'm pleased that the Labour manifesto has set out the importance of membership of the single market, membership of the customs union. That doesn't mean membership of the EU, but it does mean membership of those two things, in order that we can maintain the economic benefits and particularly the job benefits of being part of the wider European market.
Now, you know that Brexit was solved very largely on the issue of immigration. So it was a big issue. And as we've mentioned in my introduction, your constituency of East Ham is probably one of the most diverse in the country.
On the planet, actually. we describe it as the most diverse community on the planet.
Right, sorry. So to underplay,
Indeed.
Is immigration a problem, and should we have tighter controls?
During the referendum campaign, I spoke to a lot of people in this community from lots of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different faith backgrounds, and it is clear that a lot of those people were concerned about migration issues. I'm pleased that in the end we voted in favour of Remain in this area, but a very large minority voted to leave the EU, and migration was a big part of their concerns, and I understand that. I understand the worries that they had. Quite a lot of people seem to have influenced by something Priti Patel said, which was that if East Europeans couldn't come to the UK so freely in the future, then more Bangladeshi chefs could come to work in Bangladeshi Indian restaurants. Well, it is absolutely clear that's not going to happen, because the Conservatives now are saying they want fewer than 100,000 people net migration per year. Well, net migration from outside Europe was 150,000 last year, so we're clearly not going to be letting more people in from outside Europe under their plans. And I thought it was terribly, terribly disingenuous of the Conservatives to use, because they knew perfectly well they were not planning for more people from Bangladesh or India or Pakistan to come to the UK, but they gave the clear indication that that was their intention, and I'm afraid quite a number of people were misled as a result. It is an issue, of course. Migration does need to be very carefully, firmly, fairly managed. My own view is that people from other parts of Europe should be permitted to come to the UK if they've got a firm job offer. So I don't think we should operate free movement in the future in the way that EU membership has implied up until now. But I do think we need to recognise that European citizens do have a particular relationship with us in the UK, and that's going to be part of us continuing to enjoy the economic benefits of trading freely with other EU countries.
The Right Honourable Stephen Timms, I won't say MB, but prospective parliamentary candidate for East Ham. Thank you very much for joining me on Islam Channel.
Thank you, Carl.